All right, so yeah, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Graduate Student Seminar Series in Forestry and Environmental Conservation. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jim Anderson. I'm the director of the Brook Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science and the director of the James C. Kennedy Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation Center. So I'm pleased to introduce my friend and my colleague, Dr. Christy Hyman. I first met Dr. Hyman about a year ago. She reached out asking for some collaboration on one of her grant applications, which I greatly appreciated and instantly replied. And so since that time, she has made several trips down to the Brook Institute to engage with the Kennedy Center on projects related primarily to some of the historic rice fields throughout the region. So Dr. Christy Hyman is the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow for Freedom on the Move at Cornell University in the Department of History. This project is developing a historical database of fugitives from American slavery designed to rediscover the stories of self-liberating people. She's also an assistant professor of environmental justice at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She uses geographic information systems to observe how critical geography can inform us of human interspecies experiences while acknowledging phenomena deriving from oppressive systems. Dr. Hyman received a PhD in geography from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln in 2022, an MA in history from Virginia State University, and a BA in women's and gender studies from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She has two book projects. The first, The Cultural Heritage Resilience of the Great Dismal Swamp, is under contract. And her other book project, The Jerusalem Oak, mapping the counter-cartographies of freedom and struggle in the antebellum United States South, argues that enslaved people's conception of space and relation to the non-human world remapped the landscape of Southern society. This influence set the stage for the New South social order in the years following emancipation. Additionally, Dr. Hyman is collaborating with ornithologist Frederick Beaudry to develop a co-edited book on the history of the human environmental dimensions of the bobolink. A native of Laurinburg, North Carolina, Christy is now based in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. She's an avid birder and photographer with a particular affinity for fungi and birds. Christy also has family in the Georgetown area. So without further ado, Dr. Christy Hyman.
Oh, thanks, Jim. That was such a nice introduction. And I apologize, everybody. We had some really crazy weather here in Charlotte. I was in Ithaca last week, but I'm in Charlotte right now, and there was ice and there was all kinds of stuff, and so it basically made it so my internet has been really finicky, and I don't want to lose you guys. So I'm sadly you sadly won't get to see me squinting through my spectacles, but I'll be back down there in the spring when it warms up and y'all can see me in the in the flesh. But as Jim mentioned, my work is at the intersection of GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, historical geography, and spatial cognition. And I'm driven
Hey,
to the
Christy,
questions.
can you try making it full screen because we're still
Oh,
seeing
yeah.
your slides?
Okay, from Current Slide. There we go. So my main research project was taking shape in the form of two monographs, which Jim mentioned. The Jerusalem Oak, mapping the counter-cartographies of freedom and struggle in the antebellum South. And that one's under contract with UNC Press and University of Louisiana Press. Now that one, I'm shifting it because at first I wanted to focus on enslaved people's realities as they move through wilderness landscapes trying to get to freedom. But now I want to integrate how enslaved people and how they were able to also get the vegetation needed and the medicinal herbs needed so that they could survive in the state of refuge and reconnaissance. So these two books pursue answers to my questions and methods for the study of focusing on the history of human movement in wilderness spaces. So My work, it employs what they call the multi-criteria cost surface, and people who work in landscape ecology and those types of matrices of fields are very familiar with that type of geoprocessing tool, multi-criteria cost analysis, um, things like least cost analysis, um, all types of stuff. And how did I even think to put all these things together? Because people don't generally think about trying to map the historic routes of people making freedom. People just don't think that it's actually even possible because, for one, they're not aware that there are actual sources that can point us to some evidence that can help us really try to reimagine what was going on. So my work is it's a multidisciplinary approach to understanding landscape studies of space and place while allowing viewers to understand the manifold costs involved in trying to run away from places of bondage. Now, when you think about an enslaved person historically trying to run away, you have to think about the realm of navigation that they are allowed, because the very state of enslavement is captivity. So if enslaved people are only able to have a range of navigation associated with the tasks that the plantation owner is putting on them, then their ability to navigate beyond the peripheries of the plantation is very limited. So you have a gendered imbalance in terms of navigation, which means that if enslaved women wanted to run away, well, they would have had to get help from somebody. And if enslaved women wanted to run away, they would have had to they would have had to basically know a sailor, an enslaved sailor, an abolitionist who was pretending not to be an abolitionist, because in the South, white people who assisted enslaved people to freedom would be jailed. One man was actually even branded. They branded a white man because he helped some enslaved people try to escape from Florida. So there were real consequences for Black people, but also for white people. They were not lenient because historically enslaved people were seen as property. So it's a multidisciplinary approach. It's a multidisciplinary approach that tries to get at how a person realizes themselves in space when they have so many limitations to their mobility and navigation. So this exploration, it helps to reveal the peril and promise for those seeking freedom in historical geographies of containment. And it's contributed to my understanding of historical geographies of containment and the dynamics of space and these locations and critical questions about the distribution of power socially and politically, the construction of social and political reality within communities, and the place of marginalized individuals in society. So when you think about the Underground Railroad, a lot of times people think of Harriet Tubman, and if you think about the different places that commemorate Harriet Tubman's presence in those places historically, there's houses for Harriet Tubman, and there are places in Cape May, New Jersey. There are places in quite a few places in upstate New York, places in Canada, places, I mean, so many different places. And what that has to do with is the commemoration of her bravery in trying to help people get to freedom. But it also tells the story of when you don't have the capacity health wise, because she was very sickly and she had disabilities. She had physical disabilities and she wasn't rich, you know. She had to work. So when she was in Cape May, that's when she was working to build up more money in the summers in Cape May, which was a major vacation site for well-off people during the 19th century. So one can never think that there's one is just continually helping people and continually like, you know, this month I'm going to help people in Petersburg this month. No, it was not consistent like that because it was difficult for them because they didn't really have the capital. And what that meant was they did have to rely on the help of white abolitionists, Black abolitionists in the North, and Good Samaritans along the way. So when you think about GIS and you think about mapping enslaved people, it really helps to think about what type of techniques can really help you think about what happened in the past, but what kind of sources of evidence you have. So for me, a lot of the evidence came from newspapers. And what I would do is I would close read newspapers and get toponymic information about the location of places and the description of those places. And then I would create a spreadsheet and I would try to nail down the GIS coordinates for those places. So it allows one to have these innovative mapping techniques, and it also allows you to see how agricultural and land use affected those abilities. Because if a place is being cultivated consistently and there's like no wild cover, no just wild wilderness cover, then those places are going to be easier for a person to be sighted. So those places are going to be avoided. So with GIS, you can use weighting technologies. You the GIS analyst, you the GIS person, determine through reading the evidence how to weigh the scale of difficulty from one place to another. So when you think about these multi-criteria cost services, you're thinking about the myriad of obstacles it takes to achieve a particular task. The first time I heard about this particular technique with GIS, I was a grad student at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I was taught by an anthropologist who her bachelor's degree was in geography and her PhD was in anthropology. So she had those particular disciplines guiding the techniques that she was using. And her study area was Copan, Honduras. And her period in time, modern Copan. So I said to myself, if Dr. Richards Rossetto is able to map something that far in the past, and enslavement was not even that far in the past, why can't I attempt to try to do that? And while some people would have kind of thought it was a great idea, which Dr. Richards Rossetto did think it was a good idea, there were other people in the department who were very skeptical about it. And they didn't think I would be able to do it. And so they kind of were naysayers, and they kind of created a whole lot of problems for me, to the point where I had to really kind of assert myself in ways that graduate students aren't really supposed to do. Because graduate students, I mean, if you think about academia's hierarchy, when you're a student, you are always supposed to defer to your committee, you know? So it's not nice to like dissent from the decisions they have. So for me, it meant like being persistent, but not being very rude. Like thanking them for calling their skepticism to my attention, but also saying, well, your expertise, can you provide me with some pointers? And and trying to turn it around to bring it back to them. Like, okay, if you have such a terrible problem with the way I'm designing this research model, why don't you help me do it the way you would want me to do it? So that's what ended up happening. We worked together, me, Dr. Richards Rossetto, and this other professor He's no longer a professor there now. He went back to libraries, but he was very good at political geography. So his thing was census records, and his thing was like aggregate numbers. He wasn't really he was skeptical of people using what they call micro data sets because mine was micro. I was looking at counties that bordered the Great Dismal Swamp within a 40-mile radius, and every single enslaved person who ran away wasn't necessarily always recorded. And every plantation owner did not always have access to access to being able to advertise that they had a missing slave. So they, it was like this, you came from the beginning under the understanding that this can't be a complete reality, but you could try to get it as close to reality as possible by having a more nuanced approach to designing the research model. So instead of me waiting cities, because I saw cities as kind of dwelling in two worlds. Like cities for enslaved people were places where they could kind of, if they had access to ways of concealing themselves in turn, like some women dress like men, some men dress like women. Um, that they could do that, and they if they could have some type of connection in the city. I'm thinking New Orleans right now. Then they could actually eke out an existence under the cover of concealment and, never really going too far from the little market that they might sell their wares. But then again, if an enslaved person is recognizable, like maybe he or she was a former uh, domestic servant at a tavern that a lot of plantation owners frequented, then the city was not a place where they could conceal themselves. So, things like that, I had to really delineate to what extent the city itself was either a place of reconnaissance or a place of condemnation where they could get picked up. So even to this day, I'm still not quite sure what I think about cities historically, because each city kind of had its own flavor. Each city historically was trying to distinguish itself in different ways through the different production of different, whether they were doing cotton or whether they were doing rice or whether they're doing tobacco or animal husbandry. All those things tied into the ways that enslaved people can navigate and have some semblance of mobility as they moved about, um, being in captivity until they could run away. So, those are the things that I had to think about as I was trying to develop the research model for this. And so, I found maps were probably one of the best things. And I still love maps. I love old maps. And I don't mind if they aren't very intuitive, like because a map that may not be intuitive, it may have a lot of annotations on it that help me uh, determine the spatial reality of a place. So this particular map is helpful because it shows the extent of the Great Dismal Swamp um, in the year 1827. So it's much larger than it is now. And so, through timber extraction, through agricultural endeavors, and through various other extractive modes, it's now the size that it is. And it's under the stewardship of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So when you think about mapping resistance, it's like counter cartographies. And when you think about using GIS and historical analysis, it really helps you to get closer to the realities of a historical record that's very scant. It's not going to tell you much. Most runaway slave ads, they some are very detailed, but some are not very detailed. Like I've literally read some that says things like, this person is so well known in the country, I don't even have to describe. Like literally, it said that. So when you read that, that tells you that person said, even if I am very recognizable and basically hyper visible, I still decided to run away. And you can be sure that that person must have had some assistance from somewhere. A lot of times it was literacy that was a help, but a lot of times enslaved people didn't want the plantation owner to know that they learned how to read, because if they let them know they knew how to read, then they'd be under a lot more surveillance. So Harriet Jacobs is an example of this. She didn't want her plantation owner to know that she knew how to read, because plus two is like, who taught you to read? And so then you're getting somebody else in trouble. Sometimes it was little children that taught enslaved people how to read just by playing games. Sometimes on plantations, some of the enslaved children will be selected to be the playmates of the white children in the big house, and through this, they would sometimes learn how to read through games that required you to know what ABC and all that stuff was. So sometimes it was inadvertent like that, and sometimes it was like with Frederick Douglass. He was a favorite slave of a mistress in the house, and she taught him to read because she kind of looked at him like this, I don't know, kind of like a project, kind of like someone who says, this is the lowest form of human that you can find, but I have the ability to reform them and refine them. So it was one of those things like that, which, regardless of the motivation behind it, it helped Frederick Douglass because he had literacy, and that allowed him to write his own story of freedom, where most enslaved people, they had to rely on an abolitionist to write down their story. And whenever that happened, you called them amanuensis. They are amanuensis, the person who records the enslaved person's testimony, enslavement. So it makes us think about spatial dynamics and agency, and how mobility can highlight the constraints of people in the marginalized status, and it helps us think about how we mentally map our own selves and orientation to the places that we are allowed to go. So if they were a field slave picking tobacco in Virginia somewhere, then they would get up, the ram's horn would be blown by the overseer, and they would get up usually 5 or 6 a.m., and they would walk to the place of agricultural cultivation. And they would work throughout the day. At noon, that's usually when they ate. They ate like a communal meal, and that usually was the biggest meal of the day. And then they went back to work until like maybe sundown. And then when they came back to their cabins, they might have like some salt pork or some turnips, depending on what was in season. So, these are the daily realities of trying to basically understand how to survive in a state of captivity. That was how they understood how to survive in a state of captivity. Um, so when I pull it all together with the contemporary and the historic, it's how I was able to write my trade book and talk to people living today and ask them, what do they think about the Great Dismal Swamp? What do you know about the Great Dismal Swamp? Does your family have history in the Great Dismal Swamp? And I spoke to so many people. I spoke to the chief of the Nansemond tribe, Chief Samuel Bass. We had a long conversation. And I talked with a tribal leader by the name of Nikki Bass, who actually works for the EPA. And at that time, I talked to all of them in 2020, but at that time, they, by her being a federal employee, she had to be very careful the way she talked about things, because anybody who's ever worked for the federal government, knows that they are they are they are delivering government services. They're not supposed to use their capacities to like put value systems on things or tell people who to vote for, things like that. So she was real careful the way she spoke to me. But she shared a lot. She shared a lot with me. And she shared a lot about environmental justice and how, because in the Great Dismal Swamp region, because it was so agricultural based, and in the Virginia side, it was more defense industry based, it was hard to find a job for many people. So there's a lot of outmigration from the Great Dismal Swamp to Baltimore area. And a lot of people worked at what they call Bethlehem Steel in the Baltimore area. I mean, I talked to so many Great Dismal Swamp region descendants who cited that that's where their families worked for. But Nikki also said that where they lived in Baltimore, the proximity to certain polluting industries actually poisoned their entire neighborhood, and their whole neighborhood, like 2 blocks of people, had to be moved. They had to be moved, like literally, they were forced to move because it was unsafe. So, I mean, you have all of these things going on, and that's one of the reasons why she worked for the EPA, because she wanted to feel like she could do something about these polluters who can disrupt people's families by having them to have to evacuate a place, or sadly have carcinogenic components don't that claim a person's life very early through cancer diagnoses. So it's a lot involved. And what I realize is that environmental justice, historical geography, cultural mapping, all of those things were intertwined. So let's move to vagrant birds. I also want to talk about the significance of vagrant birds, as I just had a chance to tell you about the realities of enslaved people trying to flee plantations. If we think about vagrant birds, and if we think about what they call avitourism and the implications for bird population dynamics, the unpredictability of vagrant bird sightings not only enhances the allure of bird watching, but it also poses challenges in assessing the economic impact on these local communities. And further, the patterns of vagrancy sometimes are examined within the context of a changing ecological condition, including climate change and habitat availability. We all know those places where it would be a pond, and for years we could go to the pond, we could see eagles perching, we could see our wood ducks, we could see our northern pintails, we could see our green teals, green-winged teals, and then you come back the next year, and all you see is the little shore birds, because the water's gone away. The water has disappeared for ecological change of whatever variety, whether it's drought or excessive rain, whatever the case. So, when it comes to vagrancy, there's a lot of things going on in that equation. And they've become a focal point in the field of agritourism, attracting both local and national birdwatching communities. And the thrill of spotting a rare species, it brings enthusiasts together as individuals engage in competitions such as a big year, a contest to observe the greatest number of bird species within a year in a specified area. The phenomenon is brought to life in popular culture sometimes with films and media, portraying birdwatching not merely as a pastime, but as an adventurous and competitive pursuit. I'm not that kind of birder. I'm not a competitive birder, but I will say that when the snowy owl was in New Jersey back in mid-December, I did try to find it, and I did stay on that beach for 5 straight hours. It was cold too. It was cold and it was windy. I waited and waited and waited. I walked and walked and walked, and it didn't come. But it was there because somebody actually got a photograph of the snowy owl. after I left, after I got back, I checked eBird and I saw that they actually were there. So there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of excitement about it. And they generate revenue. And fluctuations in sighting durations and patterns, it complicates economic assessment and community outreach. Basically, the way that they affect the economic development of a region. So the reason I'm talking about economic development is because we know that uh, powers that be on a municipal level, they're usually always trying to attract more revenue. And sometimes just the esoteric or altruistic appreciation of a species is simply not enough. Something has to generate money so that people care about it. And so vagrant birds in that particular persuasion, then they really do have the potential to generate money. So birds typically disperse prior to breeding, with juvenile and pre-breeder individuals often exhibiting long distance vagrancy. So dispersal behaviors can vary, resulting in kind of a skewed distribution of movement distances. And so, like as early as 1922, scholar by the name of Grinnell wrote that vagrancy is an expected phenomenon driven by increasing bird populations and diverse dispersal patterns. And this characteristic of vagrancies has vital implications for species range adjustments in response to climate change, as seen in the northward spread of tropical kingbirds into Canada. And I mean, the fall of 2021, you know, people were seeing all kinds of stuff. The stellar sea eagle, we saw the hurricanes, the severe storms meant that we saw flamingos in places that we don't normally see flamingos. And even in Alberta, Canada, a Eurasian tree sparrow was documented. While in Manitoba, there was a presence of an ivory gull and a blue-gray gnatcatcher. So noteworthy rarities such as the phantom pepla and Townsend solitaire captivated local birders, illustrating the unpredictability and excitement inherent in tracking vagrant species. So the study of vagrant birds, their profound impact on agritourism, and community engagement and ecological research. These things matter. And as bird populations continue to adapt to changing and sometimes volatile environmental conditions, the importance of vagrant bird sightings in understanding population dynamics and species distribution, it will remain critical. So future research might focus on developing methodologies to assess the economic contributions of vagrant birds within localized communities while considering the implications of climate change on avian dispersal. This commitment to survival that birds have, this defiance of human-imposed borders, is present in the plight of enslaved freedom seekers as well historically, their own legacy. There, there are things that they have in common, even though it might seem that they don't have a lot in common. So, I mean, as we move forward and we think about dispersals and influencing factors and the impact of climate change, we're going to expect to see a whole lot more of these birds. We're going to see a whole lot more of these birds. And regular people, when I say regular people, I mean people who are not obsessed with birds like myself, even regular people might actually be interested in that kind of stuff. So what does that do? What does that do? Well, it makes people potentially become advocates for birds. And that is a good thing, whether it generates money or revenue or not. It's good when people care about birds because then they can make the association. They can make the association of this bird is beautiful. This bird blessed my life right now. I'm going to do what I can take so the environment is feasible enough for them to thrive in. But, we don't know where people's minds are. And we don't want to well, I don't want to, antagonize people who don't have the same values as I do. But I do like to try to think of ways that universalizing concept about borders and boundaries, how that can help us, how that can really help us come together to appreciate wildlife. So birds defy borders. When their habitats are destroyed, they expand their range to places that offer shelter and resources. And for many birds, they have evolved in ways that allow them to thrive in a range of habitats. The European starling, house sparrow, brown-headed cowbirds, three bird species that some birders dislike, are examples of birds that have evolved alongside human destruction to habitat. Because they have been so adept is surviving and their numbers are so great, they are considered nuisance birds. But what they have demonstrated is a remarkable commitment to survival. That same remarkable commitment to survival that enslaved freedom seekers historically would have shown in trying to run away. Now, historically, enslaved freedom seekers who might have made it to Philadelphia or made it to upstate New York, we can't make the assumption that as soon as they got there, everything was great for them. The only thing we can assume is that they were no longer on the yoke, under the yoke of enslavement. But a whole host of other realities and commitments came to them as a result of their ability to get into a free state. So if we think about it in terms of birds, a bird that managed to get blown to a very northern region, they're still alive, but they're having to adjust themselves and adjust their patterns and find places to feed and to hide, even though they survived being blown by these volatile storms. So even though the reasonings might be different, there's still this twin purpose of transmigratory drift that affects the realities of birds and historical enslaved freedom seekers. So that's all I got.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christy. We will now accept questions. I can look in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute and ask questions, that'd be great too.
Well, I'll start us off if nobody else will. So Christy, can you talk a little bit about, you talked about enslaved freedom seekers and their dispersal, but what were the cues or the keys that they keyed in on? Can you provide a little more insight, or is it just basically they knew the general area, where they were, the plantation areas, and so they navigated those and they just moved away as quickly as they could, and then they started seeking and picking a better way, or they just basically, try to go north as quick as they could?
Yeah, that's a good one. And what you find is there are an array of circumstances behind the motivations to run away. Sometimes an enslaved family might have ran away together to a reconnaissance space in the Great Dismal Swamp, and that the reality and the intention was not necessarily to get to a free state, but to keep themselves together and live, as maroons, so that they can remain together. Because at different junctures of a plantation, the death of a patriarch, that meant that there were going to be a division of the property. And sometimes Southern patriarchs had like 3 or 4 kids. And that patriarch might have owned just about every plantation in, Berkeley County and the surrounding counties. So what that meant was, in order for that son to make his own way in the in the slavery economy, he might have wanted to start his own outfit in Alabama or Mississippi or Texas. So that meant that there was a possibility that that family, like the sister and the brother, might have went with the oldest son, and the mama and the daddy might have stayed where the patriarch was. Then you have those singular accounts, like, and usually these are males. And the males, those are the ones who usually end up going straight to freedom. And these are people who don't have the encumbrances of children or wives. These usually were young boys, age 14 to 16. Maybe their families had been sold away since they were babies. And so there literally were no encumbrances. So, and sometimes they did it together. So there were instances where enslaved young men would band together and they would have a reconnaissance site in the Great Dismal Swamp, might have a reconnaissance site Chesapeake area, and then find a boat to hide out on and get to Philadelphia somewhere. And then you have the small things, the very small things that people have to notice, like sometimes there is signs like a scythe stuck in the ground. A scythe stuck in the ground within a vegetated area meant that don't go any further than this. This is a place where militia and dogs run rampant, and you might want to take another course. So it was almost like navigation in a punitive landscape, a landscape in which you're not supposed to be treading upon because you don't have freedom. There were calculations and decision makings that sometimes didn't make any sense. And I saw one enslaved advertisement where the woman had no toes and she had run away 3 times. So it runs the gamut. It has a lot to do, I think, with the individual depth of survival, and also a kind of I don't care what happens to me spirit too. Like, I don't care what happens to me, I'm going to keep on trying to get free. So there was an array of positions in enslaved freedom seekers, but I would say the main one was to be close to family members sold away.
I have a question. May I ask a question? This is Lynn Hanson.
Hi.
Hi there. I'm wondering about the GIS mapping that you've completed. In particular, I'd like to know if you have generated the maps, any maps that show the routes that enslaved people would take in their escapes to get to freedom, whether it's in hiding or to a free state or other territory.
Yes, that had a lot to do with my dissertation final product. Yes, but the caveat is it's a speculative predictive model. And again, it has a lot to do with what I understood from the evidence and what I understood from the interpretation of difficulty to cross a particular terrain. So if you really get in the weeds of the GIS, you're gonna have to have a set of GIS attributes and shape files and all that good stuff in order to really map it out. But you're gonna also need to have what they call a raster data set that's going to be what they call a digital terrain model. So I would get the digital terrain model from USGS, download that, plug it into the software in the ArcGIS. And so what the digital terrain model has is it has programmed into each pixel the height of change of elevation over time. So on some, like if you had a digital terrain model of the Rockies, it's going to look so much different than the digital terrain model of Eastern North Carolina because it's relatively flat. Right. But if you go to the east, if you go to the kind of eastern portion of the Great Desert Swamp, there's the Suffolk Scar. So that's a little bit of elevation, kind of like a bluff that would have been a difficult way to cross terrain. So what I did was, if the elevation was not past a certain point, then I marked those cells as easy. If there was a water crossing, I marked that as difficult. If there was a plantation home, because of the National Historic Register, we have that information on where plantations were, I would mark that as avoid. So it was like avoid water crossings, avoid plantations, avoid certain cities. And then what would happen is the GIS software would basically cough out routes that avoid all those places. But it doesn't necessarily mean that these were the places that people took. But what it does mean is it shows the range of difficulty. So basically the matrix of risk in order to cross. So I actually have an article that's going to show all of that. And when it comes out, I'll share it because it actually has all the maps. But I want to wait until it's published before I show it. But yes, that's kind of how I had to use a digital terrain model and a whole lot of shape files that allow me to place avoid or impede or facilitate navigation through that particular cell.
Okay. May I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Okay, is your article going to include any examples from your spreadsheet that shows how you entered this and kept up with all of these details across a geographical area?
Oh yes, definitely, because the first rule of any type of historical mapping project is showing the evidence that led you to it. So I usually have my spreadsheets in the appendix section of the article.
Okay.
So it should come out by the end of the summer.
Where will this be published?
The Journal of African American History.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Any other questions out there?
Yeah, I've got one. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that talk. It was really great to see. You've got a very interdisciplinary kind of holistic lens, bridging the GIS and the history and anthropology and all these different lenses. I was curious if you have any advice, for current PhD students or master students who are also attempting to bridge some of those things. We're in a wildlife and fisheries department, but we often collaborate with different, departments and fields, and just, what your experience was and what advice you might have for them.
Yeah, so they're kind of different, I'll say approaches, different fabrics of reality across the disciplines. So you have what I've noticed in the sciences is this a whole lot more positivistic. I mean, everything is definitely empirically based. And then when you have a field like geography, especially geography writ large, that's sometimes geographers don't even look at maps. They just use oral histories to explain areal differentiation in terms of cultural forms. So what I'm getting at is, depending on your department, you're going to know to what degree the department kind of likes to I hate to use this, but exercise control over their grad students. And what I've noticed in the sciences, they tend to exercise a whole lot more control, because it's usually because these students are working in labs and they're doing their own experiments. So it's a very it's an environment where you definitely want to be doing what you're supposed to be doing. A lot of faculty members thought that I did too much reading around and taking too many classes that that weren't necessarily in what I was trying to do. Like I took British literature, I took I took American literature. But even though it didn't have a whole lot to do with the actual things I was doing, something about just being able to read that classic literature and understand it, it created a greater ability for me to comprehend things that sometimes seem very dense at first. And it also provided me with the understanding that literature itself can be a lens into the way things were and the way people thought historically. So, it's one of those things where today's grad student usually wants to get the most bang for their buck. So they're not really trying to take classes that don't immediately comport with what they're doing. But I actually did not do that. But then again, I'm not the usual person. And I was not funded when I was a PhD student. So in that way, that gave me a little bit of freedom too, because I wasn't funded. So my experience was read around. Don't just read historical stuff. Don't just read geography stuff. Don't just read spatial science stuff. Also read literature of the time period that you're studying. So 19th century literature global. And also go to things that people are presenting on that may not necessarily be the same thing you do, but it opens a vista that generates more thinking on your part. So students themselves will know the type of department they have and to what degree they can do some of these things. But yeah, I would say read around.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking forward to seeing your article when it comes out as well.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right, I'll give one more opportunity for questions. All right, I think that's it, Christy. So we appreciate you spending some time with us today. Very informative. Looking forward to our future interactions as well. So thanks again for your wonderful presentation. And thanks everybody out there for attending today.